Everyone laughed when the bearded mountain man moved into a rotting treehouse on the edge of town, calling him crazy, calling it worthless, saying he'd be dead before winter. But hidden in the attic behind walls that were barely standing was a safe containing $289 million in untraceable bearer bonds, and a secret that would change everything they thought they knew about the man everyone had written off. Before you explore, we dive into the story. Make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The first time anyone in Timber Ridge saw the treehouse, it was already dying, perched 30 feet up in an ancient Douglas fir, on the forgotten edge of Willow Creek. The structure sagged like an old man's shoulders, its wooden platforms warped and green with moss, its rope ladders frayed to threads. The tree itself was massive, older than the town, older than the memories of anyone living. But the house, built into its branches, looked ready to collapse with the next strong wind. No one had lived there in over 20 years, not since old Gregory vanished without a trace, back in 2002. The town had forgotten about it, really. Teenagers used to dare each other to climb up there, but after Jenny Patterson fell and broke her arm in 2015, parents put a stop to that. The property sat vacant, tangled in legal disputes no one understood and no one cared enough to sort out. Eventually, the forest started reclaiming it. Vines crawled up the trunk, branches grew through the windows. The wooden stairs that once wound around the tree had rotted away entirely, leaving only rusty nails jutting from the bark like broken teeth. Then Marcus showed up. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, driving a pickup truck so old it looked like it had survived 3 wars. The paint had faded to a color that wasn't quite gray, wasn't quite blue, just exhausted. The truck bed was loaded with everything he owned: a canvas tent, sleeping bag, duffel bags held together with duct tape, hand tools wrapped in oilcloth, camping gear that had seen better decades, and boxes of canned food stacked like a prepper's bunker. Marcus himself looked like he'd walked straight out of the wilderness and forgotten to come back. His beard was thick and dark, streaked with gray, hanging almost to his chest. His hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and his hands were rough, scarred, the hands of someone who'd spent years working with them. He wore flannel and denim, boots with soles worn smooth, and a canvas jacket that had been patched so many times it was hard to tell what the original fabric looked like. He was 47 years old, though he looked older. The kind of older that comes not from years, but from weight, from carrying something heavy for too long. When he pulled up to the property line and stepped out of his truck, old Rita Callahan was walking her dog. She stopped dead in her tracks, squinting at him like he was a ghost. "You lost?" she called out. Marcus shook his head, barely looking at her. "No, ma'am. I'm home." Rita frowned. "Ain't nobody lived there in 20 years. Place is a death trap. Good thing I brought tools then." She watched him unload his truck for a few minutes, then hurried back to town. By noon, everyone knew. By dinner, half the town had driven past just to see the crazy man who'd moved into the treehouse. By Sunday, the jokes had started. At Murphy's Diner, where the coffee was burnt and the gossip was fresh, the regulars gathered around the counter like it was a pulpit. "I give him 2 weeks," said Dale, the mechanic, his hands still black with grease despite scrubbing. "First big storm. That whole thing's coming down. I give him 3 days," laughed Sandra, the bank teller. "You see the way those boards are rotting? He's gonna fall through and break his neck. Maybe that's what he wants," muttered Hank, the postmaster, stirring his coffee slowly. "Man doesn't move into a place like that unless he's running from something or running toward the end." They all nodded, like they understood, like they'd figured Marcus out in the 5 minutes it took him to unload his truck. That's what small towns do best. They measure you before you've even spoken, decide who you are before you've had a chance to prove otherwise. Marcus didn't care. He'd stopped caring what people thought somewhere around his 3rd deployment. Or maybe it was his 4th. Hard to remember, when the years blurred together like that, when the sounds of helicopters and gunfire still woke him at 3 in the morning, even though he'd been home for over a decade. He'd been Special Forces once, 11 years in the military, most of it classified, most of it in places that didn't officially exist. He'd learned to survive on nothing, to move through the dark without a sound, to read terrain like other men read newspapers. He'd learned to trust his instincts, to see patterns others missed, to stay alive when every odd was stacked against him. But the thing about war is it doesn't end just because you come home. It follows you. It lives in your chest, in the spaces between your heartbeats, in the silence that's never quite silent enough. After he got out, he'd tried to live normal, got a job at a construction company in Colorado, rented a small apartment, even dated a woman named Sarah for a while. But normal felt like wearing someone else's skin. He'd wake up at night drenched in sweat, Sarah shaking his shoulder, asking if he was okay. He wasn't. He never said it, but she knew. She'd try to get him to talk about it, about what he'd seen, what he'd done, but the words wouldn't come. How do you explain to someone who's lived in safety their whole life what it feels like to hold a dying friend in your arms? How do you describe the weight of decisions made in split seconds that haunt you for decades? Eventually, she left. She said she couldn't watch him disappear a little more every day. She said she loved him, but loving someone who was already half ghost was too hard. Marcus didn't blame her. He'd have left himself if he could. So Marcus did what made sense to him. He disappeared completely. He spent the next 15 years moving through the mountains, working odd jobs, living out of his truck, avoiding crowds, avoiding questions, avoiding the parts of himself he couldn't fix. He worked as a hunting guide in Montana, a trail maintainer in Wyoming, a wildfire lookout in Idaho. He learned to be alone. It was easier that way, quieter. The mountains didn't ask him about his nightmares. The forests didn't care about his scars. He'd been in Washington State, working as a seasonal ranger, when his contract ended and wasn't renewed. Budget cuts, they said. He'd been sitting in a coffee shop in a town whose name he'd already forgotten, scrolling through his phone, when he saw the listing, property for sale, Timber Ridge, Oregon, Treehouse on 5 acres, as is, no warranty, no inspection, starting bid, $800. Something about it caught his attention. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the challenge. Maybe it was the fact that it was something broken that everyone else had given up on, and he understood what that felt like. He stared at the grainy photos for a long time, at the rotting structure clinging to the massive tree, at the overgrown property, at the words, fixer-upper, that seemed almost like a joke. No one else bid. Marcus won it for $850. When the deed arrived in the mail, forwarded to the post office in the last town he'd worked, he stared at it for a long time. He didn't know why he'd done it, didn't know why this particular piece of broken-down real estate had caught his attention, but something about it felt right. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the challenge. Or maybe he was just tired of running and needed a place to finally stop. So he packed up his truck one last time and drove west toward Timber Ridge, toward the rotting treehouse in the Douglas fir, toward the place everyone else had written off as worthless. The first week was brutal. The rope ladder was unusable. So Marcus spent 2 days building a new staircase that wound around the trunk, using reclaimed lumber he found stacked behind an abandoned barn on the edge of town. The work was hard, physical, exactly what he needed. He worked dawn to dusk, his hands blistering, his back aching, but it felt good. Physical pain was easier than the other kind. It was clean, honest, something you could ice and stretch and push through. People drove by to gawk. Some honked. Some shouted jokes. One guy threw an empty beer can that bounced off Marcus's truck. Marcus didn't react, just kept working, hammering nails, cutting boards, sanding rough edges. He'd learned a long time ago that the best response to mockery was indifference. At night, he slept in his tent on the ground because the treehouse wasn't safe yet. He'd lie there listening to the wind move through the branches, to the creek babbling in the distance, to the silence that was fuller than any noise. And for the first time in years, something in his chest loosened just a fraction. The nightmares still came. They always did. But they felt less suffocating out here. Like maybe the forest could absorb some of what he carried. By the end of the second week, he'd reinforced the main platform and patched the worst of the holes in the floor. The structure had been built surprisingly well, considering. Whoever had constructed it decades ago had known what they were doing. The beams were solid cedar, thick and strong, and the joists were properly spaced. It was the roof and walls that had suffered the most, exposure to weather taking its toll. Marcus started replacing boards, one at a time. He salvaged what he could, replaced what he couldn't. He developed a rhythm, a system. Mornings were for demolition, clearing out the rot. Afternoons were for reconstruction, building it back stronger. Slowly, stubbornly, the treehouse started to look less like a ruin and more like something that might actually keep the rain out. The townspeople's jokes turned meaner. Crazy hermit thinks he's Bob the Builder. Someone spray-painted on a rock near the road. "Hey, mountain man, you know they invented apartments, right?" shouted a teenager from a passing car. At Murphy's diner, the rumors grew more elaborate. Some said Marcus was a criminal, hiding from the law. Others said he was a cult leader waiting for followers. One woman swore she'd seen him talking to himself at 2 in the morning, which wasn't entirely wrong. Marcus did talk to himself sometimes. It was better than the alternative silence. At the grocery store, when Marcus came in to buy supplies, the cashier looked at him like he might be dangerous. The mother, with 2 kids in line behind him, pulled her children closer, whispering something that made them stare. Marcus paid in cash, took his bags, and left without a word. He'd learned not to explain himself. People believed what they wanted to believe. Only one person treated him like a human being. Her name was Eliza, and she ran the hardware store on Main Street. She was in her 60s, gray hair cut short, with the kind of eyes that had seen enough of life to stop judging people for their choices. She reminded Marcus a little of his grandmother, who died while he was overseas. Same quiet strength, same refusal to participate in small-town gossip. When Marcus came in for nails and roofing tar, she didn't ask stupid questions, just rang him up and handed him his change. Sometimes she'd throw in a free box of screws or a tube of caulk. "Overstock," she'd say, though Marcus knew better. "You need help out there," she said one afternoon, not unkindly. "My son Tom does construction. He's good people. Doesn't talk much, which I figure you'd appreciate." Marcus shook his head. "I'm fine on my own. But thank you." She nodded, like she understood. "Offer stands." "And Marcus?" She waited until he looked at her. "Don't let them get to you. This town's got a bad habit of tearing down what it doesn't understand. You keep building." It was the closest thing to kindness he'd felt since arriving, and it stuck with him as he drove back to the treehouse, as he climbed the new stairs and stood on the platform 30 feet above the ground, looking out over the forest. The view from up here was incredible. You could see the mountains in the distance, their peaks dusted with early snow. You could see the creek winding through the valley like a silver thread. You could see for miles in every direction, and not a single person in sight. This was his now, this broken, forgotten place. And maybe that was fitting. Maybe broken, recognized broken. By the 3rd week, Marcus had waterproofed the roof and replaced half the wall. Panels. He'd installed a wood-burning stove he'd found at a salvage yard, rigging the chimney pipe through a hole he'd carefully cut and sealed. He'd built a rainwater collection system and run a hose down to the creek for washing. It wasn't luxury, but it was functional. It was home. He'd also started finding things. Small things at first. A coffee mug, forgotten on a shelf. a pair of reading glasses in a drawer, a paperback novel with pages swollen from moisture, signs that someone had lived here, had made a life here, before everything fell apart. And that's when he noticed something odd. He was measuring the interior space, trying to figure out where to build a sleeping loft, when he realized the dimensions didn't match. He'd been trained to read blueprints, to understand spatial relationships, to see what didn't fit, and this didn't fit. The outside of the structure was roughly 20 feet by 16 feet, but the inside felt smaller. He paced it out carefully, heel to toe like he'd been taught. 15 feet by 12 feet. That left a lot of unaccounted space. 4 feet of depth missing on one side, 3 feet missing on another. At first, he thought maybe it was insulation, extra framing for structural support. But the walls were only standard 2x4 construction. There was space there, hidden space. He checked the walls, tapping them with his knuckles, listening for hollow sounds. Most of it was solid, but in the northeast corner, behind where a bookshelf had once stood, the sound changed. It was subtle, but Marcus had been trained to notice subtle. A slight echo, a different resonance. He pulled out his knife and pried at the edge of a panel. It came loose, easier than it should have, like it had been designed to be removed. Behind it was a gap, maybe 8 inches deep, running the entire length of the wall. Inside the gap were items wrapped in plastic, old newspapers from the 1980s, photographs of people he didn't recognize, letters in sealed envelopes, a journal with a leather cover cracked from age. Everything was carefully preserved, protected from moisture and time. Marcus sat cross-legged on the floor and carefully opened one of the plastic-wrapped bundles. His hands were steady now, the same hands that used to shake when he first got out. The newspapers were yellowed, brittle, headlines about the Cold War, about economic recessions, about Olympic Games in Los Angeles. Nothing that seemed significant at first glance, but he set them aside carefully anyway. The photographs showed a man, maybe 50 years old, standing in front of the treehouse. In some photos, he was alone, hammer in hand, smiling at the camera. In others, there was a woman beside him, smiling, her hand on his arm. She had kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a braid. They looked happy, the kind of happy that comes from building something together. Marcus turned one of the photos over. On the back, written in faded ink, Gregory and Margaret, 1987. Gregory. That was the name people had mentioned. The man who'd built this place, who'd lived here for years, who'd vanished without a trace. The man whose disappearance had become local legend, whispered about in bars and around campfires. Some said he'd run off with another woman. Others said he'd fallen in the woods and was never found. A few swore he'd been murdered, though no one could say by whom or why. Marcus opened the journal, carefully. The handwriting was small, precise, the kind that belonged to someone methodical, someone who thought before they wrote. An engineer, maybe, or a scientist, someone who valued accuracy. The first entry was dated June 3rd, 1984. Began construction today. Margaret thinks I'm insane, but she's helping anyway. This place will be our sanctuary, away from everything, away from them. The entries continued, documenting the building process, the challenges, the small victories. Gregory wrote about sourcing materials, about the engineering problems of building 30 feet off the ground, about Margaret bringing him coffee in the mornings, and how her laughter echoed through the branches. It was intimate, personal, the kind of thing Marcus felt guilty reading, but couldn't stop. But as Marcus flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. The entries became shorter, more cryptic. They're asking questions again. Had to move the package. Not safe in the cabin anymore. Margaret is scared. I told her not to worry. I told her I handled it. The calls are getting more frequent. They know I know. If something happens to me, the truth is in the walls. She'll know what to do. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun coming through the window. He flipped forward, scanning entries. They became more paranoid, more fragmented. Saw a car I didn't recognize. Watched it for 2 hours. It didn't move. Changed the locks. Margaret doesn't understand. How can I explain without telling her everything? They'll come eventually. I've made peace with that. The final entry was dated November 15th, 2002. They found me. I have maybe a day, maybe less. I've hidden everything where no one will think to look. 30 feet off the ground. Inside a dying tree. In a house everyone thinks is worthless. If you're reading this, you're either the person I hoped would find it, or the person I feared would. Either way, the choice is yours now. The safe is in the attic. The combination is Margaret's birthday backward. May God forgive me for what I've done. Marcus read the entry 3 times. His hands were shaking slightly, and he forced them still. He'd learned a long time ago that fear was just information, and information was power. But this was different. This wasn't a combat situation he could analyze and react to. This was a mystery 20 years cold, with implications he couldn't begin to understand. He stood slowly, journal still in his hand, and looked around the space with new eyes. Gregory had been hiding something valuable enough to build an entire structure, to conceal it, something dangerous enough that it cost him everything. Marcus looked up at the ceiling. There was no attic. The roof slanted directly down to the walls. But as he studied the angle, he realized the pitch was steeper on the outside than it appeared from within. He'd noticed it while doing the exterior work, but hadn't thought much of it. Now, it made sense. There was space up there, hidden space. He stood slowly, running his hands along the ceiling boards, pressing, testing. In the center of the room, one board felt different, looser, newer than the others. He pushed up. It lifted. A wooden ladder, folded against itself, dropped down with a groan of rusty hinges that hadn't moved in over 2 decades. Marcus stared at it for a long moment. Every instinct he'd developed over years of combat told him to be careful, to be smart, to think before moving forward. This could be dangerous. This could be nothing. This could change everything. But curiosity, that old human weakness, was already pulling him up the ladder. The attic was dark, cramped, and smelled like old wood and secrets. Marcus pulled out his flashlight and swept the beam across the space. Dust motes danced in the light like tiny galaxies. It was larger than he'd expected, running almost the full length of the structure. The ceiling was barely 5 feet high, so he had to crouch. The floor was solid plywood, professionally installed. Someone had spent time up here. Someone had planned this. But what caught his attention wasn't the size. It was what sat in the far corner, covered with a heavy canvas tarp that had somehow survived years of heat and cold and moisture. He moved toward it slowly, his boots creaking on the old boards. Each step felt weighted with significance, like he was walking toward a moment that would divide his life into before and after. He pulled the tarp away. Dust exploded into the air, making him cough. Underneath was a safe, not a small home safe you'd buy at Walmart. This was industrial, commercial grade, the kind you'd find in a bank vault or a military installation. It was easily 4 feet tall, 3 feet wide, black steel that had been painted with some kind of rust-resistant coating. The combination dial looked like it belonged to a submarine, complex and serious, surrounded by what appeared to be additional security mechanisms. Marcus knelt in front of it, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. Whatever was inside this safe, Gregory had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide it, had paid with his life to protect it. And whatever it was, people had been willing to make him disappear for it. He reached out and touched the cold metal. The steel was smooth under his fingertips, cool and solid, and utterly unforgiving. This wasn't something you opened with a crowbar or a hammer. This was something that required knowledge, patience, precision. Margaret's birthday backward, the journal had said. Marcus pulled out the journal again, flipping through the pages, looking for any mention of dates, celebrations, anything that might give him the information he needed. And there, buried in an entry from July 19th, 1985, Margaret's 50th birthday, today, 50 years of grace and fire. I'm the luckiest man alive. 1985 minus 50. That meant she was born in 1935. But which month? Which day? He kept reading, searching, then found it in an entry from March. Spring has arrived, and so has Margaret's birthday, March 23rd. She says she doesn't want a fuss, but I'm making her favorite anyway. March 23rd, 1935. Backward, that would be 3, 2, 3, 1, 9, 3, 5. Reversed, 5, 3, 9, 1, 3, 2, 3. Marcus stared at the combination dial. His hand hovered over it, trembling slightly. This was it, the moment of truth. Either the journal was real, the combination would work, and he'd discover what Gregory had died protecting. Or this was an elaborate wild goose chase, a paranoid man's delusion, and the safe would remain sealed forever. For the first time since moving into the rotting treehouse everyone had laughed at, Marcus understood that he'd stumbled into something far bigger than a broken-down structure in a tree. He'd stumbled into a secret that someone had killed to protect, and now that secret was his. Marcus's fingers trembled as they hovered over the combination dial. The safe sat before him like a sleeping giant, black steel gleaming dully in the flashlight beam. He'd faced armed insurgents, navigated minefields, jumped from helicopters in the dead of night, but somehow this moment felt more significant than all of that, because those moments had been about survival. This was about truth. He took a breath and began turning the dial, right to 5, left past 5, twice, stopping at 3, right to 9. The mechanism clicked softly with each rotation, precise and mechanical. Left to 1, right to 3, left to 2, right to 3. Nothing happened. Marcus sat back on his heels, frustration building in his chest. He'd been so certain. The journal had been clear. Margaret's birthday backward. Unless he'd miscalculated. Unless Gregory had been paranoid enough to add another layer of misdirection. He tried again, slower this time, making sure each number clicked into place exactly. 5, 3, 9, 1, 3, 2, 3. Still nothing. The attic was getting hot, stuffy. Sweat dripped down Marcus's back, soaking through his flannel shirt. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve and stared at the dial, willing it to make sense. Think. Gregory was methodical, careful. He wouldn't have left a clue unless it was solvable. But he also wouldn't have made it too easy. Backward. Not just the numbers, but the order. Not 5, 3, 9, 1, 3, 2, 3. The full date backward, digit by digit. 3, 2, 3, 1, 9, 3. 5 became 5, 3, 9, 1, 3, 2, 3. He'd had it right. Unless. Marcus pulled out the journal again, reading the entry more carefully. March 23rd, 1935. March was month 3, day 23, year 1935. Written numerically, 3, 2, 3, 1, 9, 3, 5. But what if backward meant reversing the format entirely? Year, day, month, instead of month, day, year? Or what if it was the reverse of how it would be written? Americans wrote month, day, year. But Gregory's handwriting had a European precision to it. What if he'd been thinking day, month, year? 23, 3, 1, 9, 3, 5. Reversed. 5, 3, 9, 1, 3, 2, 3. The same combination he'd already tried. Marcus leaned his forehead against the cool steel of the safe, exhaustion washing over him. He'd been so close to something, and now he was stuck. The frustration felt familiar, like every other time in his life. when the answer had been just out of reach. He climbed back down the ladder, journal tucked under his arm, and stepped out onto the platform. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The forest stretched out below him, peaceful and indifferent to his struggle. He needed to clear his head, to approach this from a different angle. That night, Marcus lay in his sleeping bag on the treehouse floor, staring up at the ceiling where the hidden attic lay. The wood stove crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the walls. He thought about Gregory, about a man who'd built this sanctuary and filled it with secrets, about Margaret, who'd helped him build it, who'd stood beside him in those photographs with trust in her eyes. What had Gregory done that was worth hiding, worth dying for? The next morning, Marcus drove into town. If he was going to understand Gregory, he needed to know more about him. The library was a small brick building on the corner of Main and Cedar, run by a woman named Patricia, who'd been the librarian for 30 years. She looked up when Marcus walked in, her expression wary but professional. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for information about someone who used to live here." Gregory lived in the treehouse on Willow Creek property. Patricia's face changed, something flickering behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or fear. "Gregory, that was before my time here, but I remember the talk. Disappeared back in '02. Why are you asking?" "I bought the property, found some of his things, trying to understand who he was." She studied him for a long moment, then stood. "Follow me." She led him to the back room, where old newspaper archives were stored on microfiche. "We've got the Timber Ridge Gazette going back to 1955. If there was anything about Gregory, it'd be in here. You know how to use one of these?" Marcus nodded. He'd used similar systems during intelligence briefings, hunting through old records for patterns and connections. Patricia left him alone with the machine and boxes of film. Marcus started with 2002, the year Gregory disappeared. He scrolled through week by week, watching the mundane life of a small town play out in headlines: bake sales, high school football scores, a barn fire. Then, in late November, he found it. Local man missing. Gregory Hartwell, 58, has been reported missing by concerned neighbors. Hartwell, who lived alone in an unconventional treehouse residence on Willow Creek Road, was last seen November 14th. Sheriff's Department is investigating. Anyone with information is urged to contact authorities. Hartwell, that was the last name. Marcus made a note of it. 2 weeks later, another article. Search called off. After extensive investigation, authorities have suspended the active search for missing resident Gregory Hartwell. Sheriff Tom Bowen stated that while the case remains open, no evidence of foul play has been discovered. Hartwell's vehicle was found parked at his residence, and neighbors report no unusual activity in the days before his disappearance. Marcus scrolled back further, looking for any other mentions of Gregory Hartwell. He found a few scattered references. A letter to the editor about forest conservation from 1997, a mention in a community meeting about road maintenance in 1993. Nothing that explained who he was or what he might have been involved in. Then Marcus went back further, into the 1980s, and there, buried in a small article from August 1983, he found something that made his blood run cold. Former defense contractor moves to Timber Ridge. Gregory Hartwell, formerly of Los Angeles, has purchased property on Willow Creek Road. Hartwell, who worked for Lockheed Martin for 15 years in their classified projects division, cited a desire for privacy and simple living as reasons for relocating. He plans to build a unique residence on the property. Defense contractor. Classified projects. 15 years at Lockheed Martin during the height of the Cold War. Marcus sat back in his chair, mind racing. This wasn't just some eccentric man who'd built a treehouse. This was someone who'd had access to classified information, government secrets, the kind of things that didn't just disappear, the kind of things that got people disappeared. He kept searching, looking for anything else. In a Society column from 1984, he found a mention of Gregory and Margaret Hartwell attending a charity auction. In a 1987 article about a local art show, Margaret Hartwell was listed as one of the artists displaying watercolors. Then, in 1994, an obituary. Margaret Hartwell, 62, passed away peacefully at home after a brief illness. She is survived by her husband, Gregory. Services will be private. Marcus read it 3 times. Margaret had died in 1994, 8 years before Gregory disappeared. So Gregory had been alone in that treehouse for 8 years, grieving, isolated, carrying whatever secrets he'd brought from his old life. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was still incomplete. A defense contractor, with classified clearances. A man who'd left that world behind for a treehouse in the woods. A wife who'd died. A disappearance. A hidden safe. What had Gregory taken when he left? What had he been protecting? Marcus thanked Patricia and drove back to the treehouse. The sun was high now, warming the platform. He climbed back up into the attic, flashlight in hand, and knelt in front of the safe again. Think like Gregory. A man trained in security, in classified protocols. A man who would have known that the obvious answer was never the right answer. A man who would have created a combination that meant something to him, but would be nearly impossible for anyone else to guess. Margaret's birthday backward. But which Margaret? The woman in the photographs? Yes. But what if there was more to it? Marcus pulled out his phone and searched for Margaret Hartwell obituary, Timber Ridge, Oregon. The original obituary came up, but it gave no birth date. He tried variations, searching public records, databases, genealogy sites. Finally, he found it. A death certificate filed with the county. Margaret Louise Hartwell, born April 7, 1932, died September 12, 1994, April 7, 1932, not March 23, 1935. Marcus felt a surge of something between frustration and hope. He'd been working with the wrong date, but which entry in the journal had mentioned March 23rd? He flipped back through and found it. Spring has arrived, and so has Margaret's birthday, March 23rd. But the official record said April 7th. Why would Gregory write the wrong date in his journal unless he was deliberately creating misdirection? Unless he knew someone might find the journal and wanted to protect the real combination. April 7th, 1932. 4, 7, 1, 9, 3, 2, backward, 2, 3, 9, 1, 7, 4. Marcus reached for the dial again. Right to 2, left to 3, right to 9, left to 1, right to 7, left to 4. A heavy clunk echoed through the attic as something inside the safe mechanism released. Marcus's heart nearly stopped. He grabbed the handle and pulled. The door swung open with a groan of hinges that hadn't moved in over 20 years. Inside was darkness. Marcus shined his flashlight into the cavity, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Stacks of papers, folders with red classified stamps across them, photographs, computer disks in cases labeled with codes he didn't understand, and in the center, taking up most of the space, were bundles. Rectangular bundles, wrapped in plastic and sealed with tape. Marcus reached in and pulled one out. It was heavy, dense. He peeled back a corner of the plastic. Bearer bonds, hundreds of them, each one printed with elaborate scrollwork and official seals, each one marked with a value, $10,000. Marcus's hands shook as he pulled out another bundle, more bonds, and another. And another. He started counting, his military training kicking in, organizing, categorizing. Each bundle contained approximately 50 bonds, each bond worth $10,000, each bundle worth $500,000. There were dozens of bundles. He sat back, overwhelmed. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. But the weight of the bonds in his hands, the smell of old paper and ink, the official seals that looked authentic even to his untrained eye. All of it screamed that it was very, very real. Marcus started pulling out the folders, hands trembling now. The first one he opened contained photographs, black and white, grainy, showing what looked like military installations, bases he didn't recognize, aircraft that looked experimental, people in uniforms standing in front of equipment he'd never seen. The second folder contained documents, pages and pages of typed reports with sections blacked out, with security classifications Marcus recognized from his own military service. Top secret, special compartmented information, eyes only. The third folder made his blood run cold. It contained a single typed letter on Department of Defense letterhead, dated October 1983. Mr. Hartwell, this letter serves as confirmation of our agreement. In exchange for your silence regarding Project Nightfall and the events of July 1983, the sum of $289 million in bearer bonds will be transferred to your custody. These bonds are untraceable and may be redeemed through established channels. Your continued discretion is expected and required. Any breach of this agreement will result in immediate action. This letter will self-destruct. Destroy all copies. The letter was signed by someone whose name had been blacked out, but the title remained visible: Deputy Director, Defense, Advanced Research Projects Agency. Marcus read it 3 times, his mind struggling to process what he was holding. $289 million. A payoff for silence. Project Nightfall. Events in July 1983 that were significant enough to warrant this kind of hush money. Gregory Hartwell hadn't stolen this fortune. He'd been paid to keep quiet about something. Something big enough that the government had given him nearly $300 million and told him to disappear. And Gregory had done exactly that. He'd taken the money, built a treehouse in the middle of nowhere, and hidden everything in a safe that he'd put in an attic that didn't officially exist. He'd lived quietly with Margaret, and after she died, he'd lived even more quietly, alone, until someone had found him. Marcus looked at the journal entry again. They found me. I have maybe a day, maybe less. They, not the government that had paid him. Someone else. Someone who'd been looking for Gregory, or for what Gregory had hidden. Marcus's mind raced through the implications. If Gregory had disappeared in 2002 and the safe had been sealed ever since, that meant whoever had come looking for him hadn't found it. They'd made him disappear, but they hadn't found what they were looking for. And now Marcus had found it. He carefully repacked the bonds, his hands steadier now as training overrode shock. Count, categorize, secure. He organized the bundles, counting as he went. 58 bundles total. 50 bonds per bundle, at $10,000 each. 2,900 bonds. $29 million. He recounted. The same number, but the letter had said $289 million. Where was the rest? Marcus searched the safe more thoroughly, pulling out everything. More folders, more documents, more photographs. And, at the very back, behind a false panel he almost missed, he found another compartment. Inside were larger bonds, much larger, each one marked with a value of $1 million. He counted them carefully. 260 bonds, $260 million. Combined with the smaller bonds, the total was $289 million, exactly what the letter had promised. Marcus sat in the dark attic, surrounded by more money than he'd ever imagined existing in one place, and felt something close to terror. This wasn't treasure. This was a burden. This was dangerous. People had killed for this. Gregory had been made to disappear for this. And now, Marcus, the mountain man everyone laughed at, the hermit living in a rotting treehouse, was sitting on a secret that could get him killed. What happens next will force Marcus to make impossible choices, reveal a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of power, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous discoveries are the ones hiding in plain sight. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Marcus spent the next 3 hours in the attic, carefully documenting everything. He photographed each document, each bond, each piece of evidence. His phone's storage filled up quickly, so he transferred files to a backup drive he kept in his truck. Old habits from his military days. Always have redundancy. Always have backup. The classified documents painted a picture that was both fascinating and terrifying. Project Nightfall had been a black-budget program running from 1978 to 1983. From what Marcus could piece together from the heavily redacted reports, it had involved experimental aircraft, something about stealth technology that went beyond anything publicly known. One document described a test flight in July 1983 that had gone wrong. Details were blacked out, but the words "civilian casualties" and "containment failure" were visible. Another document outlined a cover story, a weather balloon explanation that Marcus recognized from other famous incidents. Gregory Hartwell had been there. As a senior engineer at Lockheed Martin, he'd been part of the team. He'd seen what happened. He'd known the truth. And the government had paid him an enormous sum to ensure that truth stayed buried. But why bearer bonds? Marcus knew enough about them to understand their appeal. They were like cash, untraceable. Bearer bonds were paid to whoever held them, with no names attached. If you had the physical bond, you could redeem it. It was the perfect way to pay someone off without leaving a paper trail. Except Gregory had never redeemed them. He'd taken the money and hidden it, living simply in his treehouse, working odd jobs in town, never touching the fortune he'd been given. Why? Marcus found part of the answer in a handwritten note tucked into one of the folders. Gregory's precise handwriting, shaky with emotion. Margaret made me promise. She said the money was blood money, that people had died, and we couldn't benefit from their deaths. She said we had to keep it safe until we knew what to do with it, until we could make it right somehow. I promised her. Even after she died, I kept that promise. But they won't let it rest. They keep looking. They think I'll break. They think I'll spend it or try to expose them. They don't understand that some promises matter more than money. Marcus felt a strange kinship with this man he'd never met. Gregory had been a soldier too, in his own way, fighting a different kind of war, but holding his ground against impossible odds. He'd kept his promise to Margaret for 20 years after her death. He'd died protecting a secret not for personal gain, but because he'd given his word. The sun was setting. By the time Marcus climbed down from the attic, his legs were stiff, his back aching from hours of crouching. He sealed the attic door carefully, making sure it looked undisturbed, then sat on the platform and stared out at the darkening forest. He needed to think, he needed to decide, because this wasn't just about finding a fortune. This was about choosing what to do with it. The smart thing would be to leave it there, seal it back up, pretend he'd never found it, live his quiet life, and let the past stay buried. Gregory had spent 20 years hiding it successfully. Marcus could do the same, but that felt wrong. Gregory hadn't wanted the money buried forever. He'd wanted to make it right somehow. And whoever had made him disappear was still out there, still looking, still dangerous. Marcus could go to the authorities. But which authorities? The government had been the one to pay Gregory off in the first place. The Department of Defense had covered up whatever happened in July 1983. Going to them seemed like a good way to end up as disappeared as Gregory. He could go public, call the newspapers, post everything online, force the truth into the light where it couldn't be hidden. But that would paint a target on his back, and it might not even work. Conspiracy theories were a dime a dozen. Without Gregory alive to testify, without additional evidence, it might just be dismissed as fake, or He could do what Gregory never got the chance to do. He could redeem the bonds, take the money, and use it the way Margaret had wanted. Find the families of whoever had died in July 1983. Make restitution. Turn blood money into something good. But that assumed he could redeem bearer bonds, worth hundreds of millions, without triggering every alarm in the financial system. That assumed whoever was looking for this fortune wouldn't notice when it suddenly surfaced after 20 years. Marcus rubbed his face, exhaustion settling into his bones. For the first time since moving here, he questioned whether buying this treehouse had been the right decision. He'd wanted isolation, peace, a place to stop running. Instead, he'd found the kind of trouble that made firefights and ambushes look simple. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Gregory, about a man who'd spent 20 years living above a fortune he refused to touch, about Margaret, who'd made him promise to keep blood money clean, about the people who'd died in July 1983, whose names he didn't know, but whose deaths had been deemed worth nearly $300 million in silence. Around midnight, Marcus heard something that made him freeze. A car engine, distant but approaching. In the 3 weeks he'd been here, no one had driven down this road at night. The property was at the end of a dead-end track, with nothing beyond it but forest. He moved to the window and looked out. Headlights, 2 sets, coming slowly down the road. They stopped about 100 yards from the property line, just beyond where his driveway began. The lights cut out. Marcus's military training kicked in instantly. He moved in the dark. No lights, no noise. He grabbed his go-bag from under his sleeping bag, the one he always kept packed out of habit. He pulled on his boots, laced them quickly. He checked the attic hatch, making sure it was secure. Then he waited. Minutes passed. 10, 15. He couldn't see anyone from this angle, but he knew they were out there, watching, waiting, doing exactly what he was doing, trying to figure out their next move. Then he saw movement. 2 figures, dressed in dark clothes, moving through the trees. They weren't trying to hide their approach, which meant either they were incredibly confident or incredibly stupid. Marcus bet on confident. They reached the base of the tree and stopped, looking up at the structure. One of them pulled out a flashlight and shined it up at the platform. Marcus pressed himself against the wall. Out of the beams, path. "Hello," one of them called out. Male voice, calm, professional. "We're looking for the property owner. We'd like to talk." Marcus said nothing. "We know you're up there." The voice continued. "We saw your truck. We're not here to cause trouble. We just want to talk about the previous owner, Gregory Hartwell." Marcus's stomach tightened. 3 weeks. He'd been here 3 weeks, and they'd already found him. How? The deed was public record, sure, but who monitored property transfers on old forgotten lots in small towns? Someone who'd been watching for 20 years, waiting for someone to finally buy the place. Someone who knew Gregory had hidden something here and was waiting for anyone stupid enough to come looking for it. Marcus had been stupid enough. "My name is Peter," the voice said. "I worked with Gregory back in the 80s. I know what happened to him. I know what he was protecting. And I know you've probably found it by now." Still, Marcus said nothing. In hostage, negotiations, in intelligence operations, silence was often the best weapon. Let them talk. Let them reveal what they knew, what they wanted. "Look," Peter continued, and now there was a hint of frustration in his voice. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is you come down. We talk like civilized people, and we work out an arrangement. The hard way is we wait until you have to come down eventually, and we have that conversation anyway. But everyone's a lot more tired and irritable." Marcus finally spoke. "What kind of arrangement?" There was a pause, then something that might have been relief in Peter's voice. "See, easy way is better. Come down, and let's talk." "We can talk fine from here," Marcus said. Another pause. "Okay, fair enough. You're military, right?" I can hear it in your voice. Special forces, if I had to guess. So, you understand operational security. You understand why some things need to stay buried. I understand why some people want them to stay buried, Marcus replied. Gregory was supposed to stay quiet. He was compensated generously for that silence. But he made copies. He kept evidence. That was a breach of agreement. So you killed him for it. We didn't kill him, Peter said, and there was genuine emotion in his voice now. Gregory was my friend, but he wouldn't let it go. He kept threatening to go public, especially after Margaret died. He lost his anchor, lost his reason to keep quiet. We tried to reason with him. We tried to remind him what was at stake. National security, international relations, the kind of things that matter more than one man's conscience. And when he wouldn't listen, he was relocated, given a new identity, new life, enough money to start over somewhere else. We thought that would be the end of it. Marcus almost laughed. You expect me to believe Gregory voluntarily disappeared, leaving everything behind? Believe what you want, but we know he hid something in that structure. We've been waiting 20 years for someone to find it. And now, you have. What makes you think I found anything? Because you're still here. If you'd climbed into that rotting treehouse and found nothing but mice and old memories, you'd have cut your losses and moved on. But you stayed. You've been working on it day and night for 3 weeks. You found something. Marcus's mind raced. They didn't know for sure. They were fishing, trying to get him to confirm what they suspected. Here's what's going to happen, Peter continued. You're going to give us whatever you found. In exchange, we're going to give you compensation. Same deal Gregory got. Enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. You take the cash, you walk away, you forget you ever heard the name Gregory Hartwell or Project Nightfall. There it was. The name, Project Nightfall. So, they knew he'd found the documents. And if I refuse? Marcus asked. Then we invoke national security concerns. We get federal agents out here. They seize the property, seal it as a crime scene, confiscate everything, including whatever you found. You get nothing except a lot of awkward questions and possibly charges for possession of classified materials. Marcus considered his options. He was one man against what sounded like a well-funded, well-connected organization. They had resources, legal authority, and the willingness to make problems disappear. He had a treehouse, a go bag, and $289 million in untraceable bonds that were simultaneously worthless and priceless. I need time to think, Marcus said finally. You have 12 hours. We'll be back at noon tomorrow. Have an answer ready. The two figures retreated to their vehicles. Marcus watched the headlights disappear down the road, then waited another 30 minutes to make sure they were really gone. Then he climbed back up to the attic and started planning. Marcus spent the hours after Peter's visit doing what he did best: planning, strategizing, preparing for every possible outcome. He spread the documents across the treehouse floor, organizing them by date, by classification level, by relevance. The picture they painted was even darker than he'd initially understood. Project Nightfall hadn't just been about experimental aircraft. It had been about something bigger, something that connected to programs with names he recognized from whispered conversations in classified briefings. Aurora, Senior, Citizen, programs that officially didn't exist, but everyone in the Black Ops community knew were real. The documents showed that on July 17, 1983, there had been a test flight at a facility in Nevada. Not Area 51, but somewhere else, somewhere even more remote. The aircraft was designated X-77, a stealth prototype that made the F-117 look primitive by comparison. Gregory had been part of the engineering team responsible for the aircraft's guidance systems. Something had gone catastrophically wrong during the test. The aircraft had malfunctioned, veered off course, and crashed not in the empty desert where it was supposed to be, but near a small town. A town Marcus had never heard of. A town that, according to current maps, didn't exist anymore. The after-action report, heavily redacted, mentioned civilian exposure, containment protocols initiated, and acceptable losses. Acceptable losses. Marcus had heard that phrase before in military briefings, always hated it. Acceptable to whom? Not to the people who died. One document included a casualty list. 14 names, ages ranging from 6 years old to 72. 14 people who'd been in the wrong place when an experimental stealth aircraft fell from the sky. 14 people whose deaths had been covered up, explained away as a gas leak or a fire, or whatever story the government had manufactured. And Gregory Hartwell had been offered $289 million. Ensure those 14 people stayed forgotten. Marcus found photographs. Not official ones, but personal ones, taken by Gregory himself from what looked like a concealed camera. Images of the crash site before the cleanup crews arrived. The wreckage of the X-77, scattered across what looked like a residential area. Houses destroyed. A school bus, on its side, burned. Bodies covered with tarps. One photograph showed Gregory standing with another man, both in civilian clothes, but surrounded by military personnel. The other man was older, distinguished, with gray hair and the bearing of someone important. On the back of the photograph, Gregory had written, General Raymond Ashford, Project Director. The man who decided 14 lives were worth less than one secret. Marcus sat back, the photograph trembling in his hands. This wasn't just about money or silence. This was about justice denied, about victims who'd never been acknowledged, about families who'd never known what really happened to their loved ones. He understood now why Margaret had called it blood money. Every bond in that safe represented someone who died and been erased from history. The dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold. Marcus hadn't slept. He'd spent the night reading every document, studying every photograph, understanding the full weight of what Gregory had carried for 2 decades. No wonder the man had seemed paranoid in his journal entries. He hadn't been paranoid enough. At 7 in the morning, Marcus climbed down from the treehouse and drove into town. He needed to talk to someone who might understand, someone he could trust. Eliza at the hardware store had been the only person who'd shown him kindness since he'd arrived. It was a thin thread to hang hope on, but it was all he had. The store was just opening when he arrived. Eliza was unlocking the front door, coffee cup in hand. She looked up at him and immediately frowned. You look like hell. When's the last time you slept? Couple days ago, Marcus admitted. Can we talk? Privately. She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. Come on. Office is in the back. The office was cramped, filled with filing cabinets and inventory lists. Eliza closed the door and sat behind her desk. What's going on? You in some kind of trouble? Marcus didn't know where to start. So, he started at the beginning. He told her about finding the hidden attic, about the safe, about Gregory's journal. He didn't mention the bonds or the exact nature of what he'd found. Not yet. He needed to see if she could be trusted. Eliza listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat back and let out a long breath. Gregory. God, I haven't thought about him in years. He used to come in here sometimes, buying supplies. Quiet man. Polite. Sad, especially after his wife died. Did you know him well? Not really. But I knew Margaret better. She taught art classes at the community center for a while, back in the 80s. My daughter took her class. Margaret was kind, gentle, the type of person who saw good in everything. Eliza paused. But I remember something strange. After she got sick, before she died, she came into the store one day, pulled me aside and said the oddest thing. She said, if anything ever happens to Gregory, if he ever disappears, or something seems wrong, promise me, you'll make sure people know he was a good man. Promise me, people will know he tried to do the right thing. Marcus felt chills run down his spine. What did you say? I promised. Of course. Thought it was just the illness talking, you know? Making her worried about things that didn't make sense. But then Gregory did disappear. And I remembered. I told the sheriff what Margaret had said, but he just wrote it off as a coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence, Marcus said quietly. Eliza leaned forward. What did you find up there, Marcus? What was Gregory protecting? Marcus made a decision. He pulled out his phone and showed her one of the photographs he'd taken. The one of the crash site. The one with the school bus. Eliza's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God. What is this? A government cover-up from 1983. An experimental aircraft crashed and killed 14 civilians. Gregory was part of the project. They paid him to stay quiet about it. Paid him. How much? Marcus hesitated, then said, $289 million. Eliza's eyes went wide. And it's still there? In the treehouse? Marcus nodded. Hidden in bearer bonds. Untraceable. Unredeemed. Gregory never spent a penny of it. And now people are coming to take it back. What people? The same ones who made Gregory disappear. They showed up last night. Gave me 12 hours to hand it over. Eliza stood up and paced the small office. Jesus. Marcus. You need to get out of here. You need to disappear. Like Gregory did. Except actually disappear. Not whatever they did to him. I can't, Marcus said. Because this isn't just about the money. It's about those 14 people who died and were forgotten. It's about families who never knew the truth. Gregory kept this evidence for a reason. He wanted someone to do what he couldn't bring himself to do. Which is what? Tell the truth. Eliza stopped pacing and looked at him. That's suicide. You go public with this. They'll destroy you. Or worse. Maybe, Marcus said. But I didn't survive 2 tours in Afghanistan and 3 in Iraq to come home and let bullies push me around. I've faced worse than guys in suits, making threats. Have you? Eliza asked quietly. Because these guys, they don't fight fair. They don't follow rules. Gregory learned that the hard way. Marcus stood. I need to know what happened to Gregory. Really happened. Not the official story. Do you know anyone who might know the truth? Eliza thought for a moment. Maybe. There's a woman, lives out past Miller's Creek. Name's Dorothy. She was Gregory's neighbor back when he first built the treehouse. They were friends, her and Margaret. After Margaret died, Dorothy would bring Gregory meals sometimes, check on him. She was the one who reported him missing. Can you give me her address? Eliza wrote it down on a piece of paper. Marcus, be careful. Whatever you're planning, think it through. Gregory had 20 years to figure out what to do, and he never did. There might be a reason for that. Or maybe, Marcus said, he was just waiting for the right person to finish what he started. Dorothy lived in a small farmhouse at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by fields that had gone mostly to seed. She was in her 70s now, gray-haired and bent with age, but her eyes were sharp when she answered the door. Can I help you? She asked warily. My name is Marcus. I bought Gregory Hartwell's property. I was hoping you could answer some questions about him. Her expression changed immediately. You found something, didn't you? That's why you're here. Marcus nodded slowly. Can we talk? She invited him in. The house smelled like lavender and old wood. Photographs covered every surface. Family, friends, memories accumulated over decades. Dorothy made tea without asking if he wanted any, then sat across from him at her kitchen table. I knew eventually someone would buy that place and find what Gregory hid, she said. Been waiting 20 years for this conversation. You knew about the safe. Not specifically, but I knew Gregory had something. He told me once, after Margaret died. He was drinking, which he almost never did, and he got emotional. Said he was living on blood money. Said he couldn't spend it, couldn't get rid of it, couldn't make it right. I asked him what he meant, but he wouldn't say. Just kept apologizing to Margaret like she was still there. What happened the night he disappeared? Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. I was here, working in my garden. It was late afternoon, sun just starting to set. I heard helicopters. Military helicopters flew right over my property heading toward Gregory's place. 3 of them. They circled his treehouse for maybe 5 minutes, then landed in the clearing nearby. You saw this? I grabbed my binoculars, watched the whole thing. Men in dark uniforms got out, surrounded the base of the tree. Gregory was up on the platform. I saw him standing there, hands up, not fighting. They used a bullhorn, told him to come down. He did. They put him in one of the helicopters and left. Whole thing took maybe 20 minutes. Did you tell the sheriff? Of course I did. He said I was mistaken, that there were no military operations in the area that day. Said maybe I saw a medical helicopter or something. But I know what I saw. Those were military helicopters, and they took Gregory away. Marcus felt cold. And you never saw him again? Never. A few days later, some men in suits came to my house. Said they were federal agents. Showed me badges. I couldn't read close enough to verify. They said Gregory had been involved in classified work, that his disappearance was part of a relocation program for his own safety, and that I needed to forget what I'd seen. Said if I talked about it, I could be prosecuted for interfering with national security. But you're telling me now? Dorothy smiled sadly. I'm 76 years old. Cancer. Stage 4. Doctor gives me maybe 6 months. What are they going to do? Threaten me with prison. I've kept quiet for 20 years because I was scared. But I'm not scared anymore. And if you found what Gregory hid, if you're planning to do something with it, then it's time someone told the truth. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. Thank you. This helps more than you know. What are you going to do? She asked. I don't know yet. But whatever it is, I promise you, Gregory's story won't be forgotten. Marcus spent the rest of the morning driving through the county, thinking, planning. Peter had said noon. That gave him a few more hours to decide. He could hand over everything, take whatever payment they offered, and walk away. It was the smart choice, the safe choice. Or he could fight. But fighting meant exposing himself, putting a target on his back, possibly ending up like Gregory, disappeared into some black site program where inconvenient people vanished. There was a third option, one that had been forming in his mind since he'd read about the 14 victims. He could use the money the way Margaret had wanted. Find the families, make restitution, turn blood money into something that honored the dead rather than buried them. But that assumed he could redeem bearer bonds worth hundreds of millions without triggering alarms. It assumed he could outmaneuver people who'd been covering up secrets for 40 years. It assumed he was smarter, faster, and luckier than Gregory had been. At 11:30, Marcus drove back to the treehouse. Peter's 2 vehicles were already there, parked in the same spot as the night before. Peter stood beside one of them, checking his watch. He looked up when Marcus pulled in. Cutting it close, Peter said. Marcus stepped out of his truck. I had some thinking to do, and I want to know what really happened to Gregory. Not the story about relocation and new identities. The truth. Peter's expression didn't change. That's not part of our agreement. Then, there's no agreement, Marcus said flatly. Peter sighed. Gregory wouldn't cooperate. He'd been quiet for years, took the money, built his little hideaway, lived peacefully. But after Margaret died, something changed in him. He started making noise, contacted journalists, lawyers, people who asked too many questions. We couldn't let him compromise the program. So you killed him. We offered him a way out. New identity, new location, more money. He refused. Said he'd rather die than keep lying. Peter's voice was cold now. So we gave him what he wanted. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, hot and familiar. The same rage he'd felt in combat when he saw civilians caught in crossfire, when he saw the cost of decisions made by people sitting safely behind desks. "Where?" he asked through gritted teeth. "Where what? Where is his body?" Peter smiled. "Does it matter? He's gone. Has been for 20 years. Nothing you do will bring him back. It matters to Dorothy. It matters to anyone who cared about him. It matters because people deserve to know what happened to the ones they love. Dorothy, who lives in the farmhouse." Peter's smile widened. "Stage 4. Cancer. 6 months to live according to her medical records. She won't be telling anyone anything for much longer." The casual cruelty of it, the cold calculation, snapped something in Marcus. He'd spent years fighting enemies who at least had the decency to shoot back. These people killed with paperwork and silence, and made threats to dying old women. "Here's my counteroffer," Marcus said quietly. "You leave. You forget about me. Forget about this property. Forget about whatever you think is hidden here. And in exchange, I don't send copies of everything I found to every major news outlet, every senator, every journalist I can find." Peter laughed. "You think we haven't heard that before? Gregory tried the same thing. No one believed him. No one will believe you. Conspiracy theories are cheap. Evidence can be discredited. You're one man with some old documents and a wild story." "Maybe," Marcus said. "But I'm also one man with nothing to lose. I don't have a family to threaten. I don't have a career to destroy. I don't have anything you can take from me except my life. And honestly, there are days I'm not all that attached to it anyway." For the first time, Peter's confidence wavered. "You're making a mistake." "Probably. But it's my mistake to make." Marcus turned and started walking toward his truck. "We'll be back," Peter called after him. "And next time, we won't be asking nicely." Marcus didn't respond, just climbed into his truck and drove away. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel, adrenaline flooding his system. He'd just declared war on people with unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. It was possibly the stupidest thing he'd done since volunteering for back-to-back deployments in active war zones. But it also felt right. For the first time since coming home, since leaving the service, since Sarah had walked away and he'd started disappearing into the mountains, Marcus felt like he had a purpose, a mission. He drove straight to Eliza's hardware store. She was helping a customer when he walked in, but she saw his face and quickly finished the transaction. "What happened?" "I need your help," Marcus said. "I need to copy everything I found onto multiple drives. I need to send it to people who can protect it. And I need to do it fast, because the people looking for it aren't going to give me much time." "Marcus, what did you do?" "I told them no." Eliza stared at him for a long moment, then locked the front door of the store and flipped the sign to closed. "Come on. My son has equipment in his basement. We can work there." They spent the next 6 hours in Tom's basement, a space cluttered with computer equipment and networking gear. Tom turned out to be a tech specialist who'd worked in cybersecurity before moving back to Timber Ridge to help his mother with the store. When Eliza explained what they needed, he didn't ask questions, just got to work. They scanned every document. They made encrypted copies on multiple drives. They uploaded files to secure cloud storage, with passwords Marcus memorized, and then destroyed the written copies of. Tom showed Marcus how to set up dead man switches, automated systems that would release the information if Marcus didn't check in regularly. "This is serious stuff," Tom said as he worked. "If what you're saying is true, you're going up against people who've kept this buried for 4 decades. They're not going to let it go without a fight." "I know," Marcus said. "That's why I need to make sure the information survives, even if I don't." By midnight, they had everything backed up, encrypted, and distributed. Marcus had copies, Tom had copies, and packages were being mailed to journalists and lawyers, with instructions not to open them, unless Marcus disappeared or died. "Now what?" Eliza asked. "Now I go public. Marcus said. I contact the press. I tell Gregory's story. I name names. And I dare them to try to stop me. They'll kill you, Eliza said quietly. Maybe. But they'll have to do it publicly now. And that's a lot messier than making someone disappear quietly in the middle of the night. Tom looked up from his computer. There's someone you should talk to. Journalist, named Sarah Chen. She specializes in government cover-ups and classified programs. She's legit. Got sources inside the Pentagon. Won congressional hearings on black budget programs back in 2018. If anyone can help you tell this story, it's her. Marcus felt something twist in his chest at the name Sarah. Different Sarah, he told himself. The world was full of Sarahs. Can you get me her contact information? Tom was already typing. I'll send you her encrypted email address. But Marcus, you need to understand something. Once you contact her, once this story goes live, there's no going back. Your life as you know it ends. You'll be famous or infamous. You'll be a target. Every crazy person, every government agent, every opportunist, they'll all know your name and your face. I've been invisible for 15 years, Marcus said. Maybe it's time people saw me again. At 2 a.m, Marcus sent the email. He kept it simple, direct, the kind of communication he'd used in military briefings. My name is Marcus. I have evidence of a government cover-up from 1983 involving 14 civilian deaths and a payoff of $289 million. The previous owner of this information was disappeared. I have documents, photographs, and testimony. If you're interested in the truth, contact me. If not, I'll find someone who is. He included his phone number and hit send. Then he drove back to the treehouse, climbed up to the platform, and waited for dawn. The forest was quiet, peaceful, indifferent to the storm he'd just unleashed. Somewhere out there, Peter and his people were planning their next move. Somewhere in Washington or Virginia, or wherever these shadow operators lived, alarms were going off, as they realized Marcus wasn't going to cooperate quietly. Marcus thought about Gregory, about a man who'd spent 20 years trying to figure out how to do the right thing, who'd kept his promise to his wife, even after she died, who'd been willing to die rather than keep lying. I'll finish what you started, Marcus whispered to the empty air. I promise. His phone rang at 6:15 in the morning. Unknown number, Marcus answered. This is Sarah Chen, a woman's voice said. I got your email. I have about 1,000 questions. But first, I need to know, are you for real, or are you wasting my time? I'm for real, Marcus said. And I can prove it. Then we need to meet. Today. Somewhere public. Somewhere safe. Because if what you're telling me is true, you're sitting on the biggest story I've ever covered. And you're also in more danger than you probably realize. I realize, Marcus said. Where do you want to meet? They agreed on a coffee shop in Portland, 3 hours away. Neutral ground. Public enough to be safe. Private enough to talk. Marcus packed his go-bag, grabbed one of the backup drives, and headed out. As he drove away from the treehouse, he looked in his rearview mirror at the structure that had changed his life. The rotting treehouse everyone had laughed at. The worthless property he'd bought for $800 and pasa, $50. The place that had hidden secrets worth killing for. He didn't know if he'd ever see it again. Didn't know if the next few days would end with his story on the front page, or with him in an unmarked grave like Gregory. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus felt alive. Felt like he was fighting for something that mattered. Felt like maybe the years of running and hiding and trying to forget had led him exactly where he needed to be. The mountain man everyone had mocked was about to shake the foundations of power, and they had no idea what was coming. The coffee shop in Portland was one of those places that tried too hard to be quirky. Mismatched furniture, exposed brick, art on the walls that looked like someone had thrown paint at a canvas and called it profound. Marcus arrived 30 minutes early. Old habits from tactical operations. Scout the location, identify exits, position yourself with your back to a wall, and a clear view of the entrance. Sarah Chen walked in at exactly 11 o'clock. She was younger than Marcus expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes that swept the room the same way his had. Professional paranoia, the kind you developed when your job involved exposing powerful people's secrets. She spotted Marcus immediately, probably because he was the only person in the place who looked like he'd crawled out of the wilderness. She sat down across from him without ordering coffee. "You brought proof?" Marcus slid the encrypted drive across the table. "Everything. Documents, photographs, testimony. Enough to burn down whoever's been covering this up for 40 years. Sarah picked up the drive, examining it. "Who else knows about this?" "A few people. Insurance, in case something happens to me." "Smart." She pocketed the drive. "I need to verify this before I commit to anything. If it's real, I'll run the story. If it's not, we never had this conversation." "It's real," Marcus said quietly. 14 people died. A man named Gregory Hartwell spent 20 years protecting the evidence. They disappeared him for it. "I'm not letting his story die with him." Sarah studied his face for a long moment. "You understand what's going to happen when this goes public. Your life won't be yours anymore. You'll be famous, hunted, celebrated, and vilified all at once. People will call you a hero and a traitor in the same breath. The government will come after you with everything they have. I've been shot at by people who really wanted me dead," Marcus said. "I can handle bureaucrats and lawyers. Can you handle being alone? Because that's what happens to whistleblowers. Friends disappear. Family stops calling. The whole world splits into people who want to use you and people who want to destroy you." Marcus almost smiled. "I've been alone for 15 years. At least now I'll be alone for a reason." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "I'll have an answer for you in 48 hours. Keep your phone on. Don't go anywhere. I can't reach you. And Marcus, watch your back. The people you're exposing have made bigger problems than you disappear." She left without ordering coffee, the drive hidden in her jacket pocket. Marcus sat there for a while longer, drinking terrible overpriced coffee, and wondering if he'd just made the best decision of his life or signed his own death warrant. The drive back to Timber Ridge took 3 hours. Marcus spent them watching his mirrors, checking for tails, running through contingency plans, but no one followed him. The forest road was empty when he pulled in, the treehouse standing silent against the afternoon sky. He climbed up to the platform and sat on the edge, legs dangling over the side, 30 feet of empty air beneath his boots. The view was incredible from up here. You could see the whole valley, the creek winding through it like a silver thread, the mountains rising in the distance, with their peaks touched by early snow. Gregory had chosen well. This was a good place to hide, a good place to think, a good place to make a stand. Marcus's phone rang. "Unknown number," he answered cautiously. "Yeah? Marcus, it's Dorothy." The old woman's voice was weak, strained. "They came to my house. 2 men. Said they were from the government. They asked about you. Asked what we talked about." Marcus felt ice in his veins. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. Told them I didn't know what they were talking about." "But Marcus, I'm scared. They said things, implied things, made it clear they knew I was sick, knew I was dying. Said it would be a shame if my last days were spent under investigation." "I'm sorry," Marcus said, guilt heavy in his chest. "I shouldn't have dragged you into this. Don't you dare apologize. I told you I'm not afraid anymore. But you need to know they're watching you. They know you went to Portland. They probably know you met with someone." After Dorothy hung up, Marcus sat in silence, processing. They were tracking him. Probably had been since he first contacted Sarah Chen, which meant they knew a story was coming. which meant they'd be preparing their response, their counter-narrative, their plan to discredit him before the truth could spread. Marcus spent that night in the attic, going through every document again, memorizing names, dates, details. If they tried to claim the evidence was fake, he needed to be able to defend it. If they tried to paint Gregory as a traitor or a thief, Marcus needed to tell the real story. He found something he'd missed before, a small notation in the margin of one of Gregory's journal entries. Margaret's words, "The dead don't need money, the living do. Find their families, make it right." Marcus stared at those words for a long time. Margaret had known. She'd understood that the bonds sitting in the safe weren't treasure. They were debt. Debt owed to the 14 people who died, to their families who'd never known the truth. An idea began forming in Marcus's mind. Dangerous, complicated, possibly illegal, but right. Sarah Chen called 48 hours later, at exactly 11 o'clock at night. "It's real. I've verified the documents with 3 independent sources. The crash happened. Project Nightfall existed. General Raymond Ashford, who's now retired and sitting on the board of half a dozen defense contractors, was the project director. And your Gregory Hartwell was paid off to keep quiet." "When does the story run?" Marcus asked. "Tomorrow morning. Front page of the Washington Post, with supporting documentation online. I've coordinated with other outlets. They'll pick it up within hours. By noon tomorrow, this will be everywhere." Marcus felt something between relief and dread. "What happens to me?" "You'll get calls. Lots of them. Media, lawyers, government agencies. My advice? Don't talk to anyone except through a lawyer. I can recommend someone who specializes in whistleblower cases. His name is David Park, and he's defended people going up against the NSA, the CIA, and the Pentagon. If anyone can keep you out of prison, it's him. Prison? You're in possession of classified documents. Technically, that's a federal crime. They'll probably try to charge you, threaten you with decades in prison, to force you to surrender everything and stay quiet. David can fight that. But you need to call him tonight." Marcus called David Park at 11:30. The lawyer answered on the second ring, wide awake, despite the hour. "Sarah briefed me. I've been expecting your call. Here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow, when the story breaks, you're going to become public enemy number 1 to a lot of very powerful people. They're going to throw everything at you. Espionage Act, theft of government property, maybe even terrorism charges, if they're feeling creative. Can they make those stick? If you were anyone else? Maybe. But you're a decorated veteran with an honorable discharge. You bought the property legally. You discovered the documents by accident. And most importantly, the documents prove crimes committed by government officials. There's a strong public interest defense. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but I can keep you out of prison. What's it going to cost?" David was quiet for a moment. "Sarah told me about the bearer bonds, about the $289 million. I'm going to be honest with you, Marcus. If this goes to trial, my fees could run into the millions. But here's what I'm thinking. You use some of that money to pay me. We fight this battle together, and when we win, we use the rest of the money to do what Gregory Hartwell wanted. We find the families of those 14 victims, and we make restitution. The bonds are untraceable," Marcus said. "How do I even redeem them without setting off alarms? Carefully, slowly, through intermediaries and shell companies. It's legal if done right, and I know people who can make it happen. The government will try to seize the bonds, claim their evidence in a criminal case. But if we move fast, get them converted before they can freeze anything, we can protect the money long enough to do some good with it." Marcus thought about Margaret's words. "The dead don't need money. The living do." "Okay, tell me what to do." The next morning, Marcus woke to his phone, vibrating non-stop. Texts, missed calls, voicemails piling up by the dozen. He ignored them all and pulled up the Washington Post on his phone. The headline filled the screen. 40-year cover-up exposed. Classified aircraft crash killed 14 civilians. Government paid millions to silence witness. Below it was Sarah Chen's byline, and below that, a photograph of the X-77 wreckage, with the burned school bus visible in the background. Marcus's stomach turned at the image, but he kept reading. The article was thorough, devastating. It named names, including General Raymond Ashford. It detailed the timeline of the crash, the cover-up, the payoff to Gregory Hartwell. It included testimony from Dorothy about Gregory's disappearance. And it ended with a quote from Marcus. The government spent $289 million to hide the truth about 14 innocent people who died. That money belongs to their families. I intend to make sure they get it. By noon, the story was everywhere. Cable news, social media, international outlets. Marcus's face, pulled from his old military ID photo, was on every screen. His name was trending. The Treehouse, photographed from the road by enterprising journalists, became an instant landmark. And the calls kept coming. Reporters begging for interviews, lawyers offering their services, conspiracy theorists claiming they'd known about Project Nightfall all along. And, inevitably, threats. Anonymous messages telling him to watch his back, to keep his mouth shut, promising that he'd end up like Gregory. Marcus ignored them all. He had work to do. David Park arrived in Timber Ridge that afternoon with a team of associates, forensic accountants, and security personnel. They set up a makeshift office in Eliza's hardware store, which she'd closed to the public. Tom's basement became a data center, and Marcus's treehouse became the most famous address in America. The first challenge was securing the bonds before the government could seize them. David had anticipated this. Within hours of the story breaking, he'd filed motions in federal court, arguing that the bonds were private property, not government assets, and that any attempt to seize them would violate Marcus's constitutional rights. It was a delaying tactic, but it bought them time. Meanwhile, David's financial team began the careful process of redeeming the bonds. Small amounts at first, through different institutions, using legal entities set up specifically for this purpose. The goal wasn't to hide the money. It was to convert it from bonds into accounts that could be protected and distributed. The government, as predicted, came hard and fast. The FBI showed up at the treehouse with a warrant. Marcus, on David's advice, cooperated fully. They searched every inch of the property, photographed everything, seized the safe itself, even though it was empty now, the bonds and documents already secured elsewhere. They arrested Marcus on a Friday afternoon. Charges: possession of classified information, theft of government property, and obstruction of justice. David had warned him this would happen. Marcus went quietly, hands behind his back, federal agents leading him to a waiting car, while cameras from a dozen news outlets recorded every second. He spent 3 days in federal custody before David got him released on bail. The bail hearing became a media circus. David argued passionately that Marcus was a decorated veteran, not a criminal, that he'd exposed government wrongdoing, not committed treason. The judge, swayed by public opinion and the weakness of the government's case, agreed to release him with an ankle monitor and strict conditions. When Marcus walked out of the courthouse, he was met by something he hadn't expected. Protesters, hundreds of them, holding signs that read, "Free Marcus," and "Justice for the 14," and "Heroes don't belong in prison." They cheered when they saw him, a roar of support that made his chest tighten with emotion. Eliza was waiting at the edge of the crowd. She pushed through and hugged him fiercely. "Welcome back. You've got half the country on your side. What about the other half?" Marcus asked. "They think you're a traitor who should be shot, but we don't talk to them." Back in Timber Ridge, everything had changed. The town that had mocked him was now divided. Some residents saw him as a hero who'd exposed government corruption. Others saw him as trouble who'd brought unwanted attention to their quiet community. Town council meetings became shouting matches. The hardware store received threats for supporting Marcus. Someone threw a brick through Tom's window with a note that said, "Traitor's friend." But something else was happening too. People were coming forward. People who'd known Gregory and Margaret. People who'd suspected something was wrong, but had been too afraid to speak up. They brought photographs, letters, memories. They shared stories of the kind, quiet couple who'd lived in the treehouse, who'd been good neighbors until the day Gregory vanished. And then the families started arriving. The families of the 14 victims. It started with a woman named Patricia Summers. She was 62 years old, lived in Arizona, and cried when she walked into Eliza's hardware store, where Marcus was working with David's team. "My brother died in that crash," she said, voice shaking. "Tommy Summers. He was 9 years old. I was 7. My parents were told it was a gas leak at the school. We buried an empty coffin because there wasn't enough left to bury. I've spent 55 years thinking it was an accident. And now you're telling me it was a cover-up? That someone paid millions to hide what really happened?" Marcus stood, not knowing what to say. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Don't apologize. You didn't do this. You exposed it." She wiped her eyes. "I saw the article. It said you're trying to give the money to the families. Is that true?" Marcus nodded. "It's what the man who hid it wanted. What his wife wanted. To make it right somehow." "How much?" Patricia asked. $289 million. Divided among 14 families. That's about $20 million each. Patricia sat down hard in a chair. $20 million. For Tommy. "It won't bring him back," Marcus said quietly. "But it's acknowledgement. It's the government admitting, even indirectly, that those lives mattered, that they weren't just acceptable losses." Over the next month, Marcus and David's team located all 14 families. Some were easy to find, still living, in the same area, connected through relatives. Others took investigation, tracking down descendants, finding people who'd scattered across the country in the decades since the crash. Each conversation was different. Some families were angry, demanding answers Marcus couldn't give. Others were grateful, overwhelmed by the acknowledgement of what they'd lost. One elderly man, father of a victim, said simply, "I knew something was wrong. I knew it in my bones. Thank you for proving I wasn't crazy." The legal battle over the bonds raged on. The government argued that the money was payment for illegal activity, that it should be forfeited to the Treasury. David argued that it was compensation for silence, not payment for a crime, and that the families of the victims had the stronger moral and legal claim. The case went to federal court. It became a media sensation, broadcast live, analyzed endlessly. Marcus testified for 3 days, telling the story of how he'd bought a rotting treehouse for $850 and found a secret that changed everything. The prosecution tried to paint him as an opportunist, someone who'd stumbled onto a fortune and was using a tragic story to legitimize theft. But David destroyed that narrative. He brought in Dorothy, frail but fierce, testifying about Gregory's disappearance. He brought in the families, sharing their pain and loss. He presented evidence that the government had known about the civilian casualties and had actively covered them up. And he played the final card. A video recording Marcus had found in the safe's hidden compartment, something he'd kept secret until the trial. Gregory Hartwell himself recorded a week before his disappearance, sitting in the treehouse, speaking directly to the camera. "My name is Gregory Hartwell. If you're watching this, I'm probably dead or disappeared. I want it known that I was paid $289 million to stay silent about the deaths of 14 innocent people. I took that money because I was scared, because I wanted to protect my wife, because I was weak. But Margaret made me promise to make it right someday. I never figured out how. Maybe you will. The money's in the safe. The combination is her real birthday. not the fake one in my journal. Give it to the families. Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them their loved ones weren't forgotten." The video played in absolute silence in the courtroom. When it ended, the judge took off her glasses and wiped her eyes. Even the prosecution looked shaken. The judge ruled in Marcus's favor. The bonds belonged to the families of the victims. The government's case against Marcus was dismissed with prejudice, and in a scathing written opinion, the judge condemned the cover-up, calling it a betrayal of public trust and an offense to the memory of innocent lives lost. Marcus walked out of the courthouse, a free man. The ankle monitor came off, the charges were dropped, and the work of distributing the drained money began. It took 6 months to convert all the bonds, to set up trusts, to ensure each family received their share legally and securely. David handled most of it, but Marcus insisted on being part of every distribution. He wanted to look each family in the eye, to tell them about Gregory and Margaret, to explain why it had taken 40 years for this moment to arrive. Some families used the money to start foundations in memory of their loved ones. Others donated to causes like aviation, safety, or government transparency. One woman used her share to fund scholarships for children of military families, saying, "My dad served his country, and his country killed him and lied about it. Maybe this can help other families avoid that pain." Patricia Summers, whose 9-year-old brother had died in the crash, created the Tommy Summers Memorial Library in her hometown. She invited Marcus to the opening. He stood in the bright, beautiful space filled with books and light, and felt something in his chest that hadn't been there in years. "Peace. Thank you," Patricia said, squeezing his hand. "Not just for the money, for caring enough to see this through, for giving Tommy back his story." Back in Timber Ridge, the town slowly came around. The residents who'd called Marcus crazy, who'd mocked him for living in a rotting treehouse, began to see him differently. He wasn't a hermit anymore. He was the man who'd stood up to the government and won. The man who'd honored a promise made by 2 people he'd never met. The man who'd proven that even small, forgotten places could matter. Murphy's Diner, where the gossip had once been cruel, now served a sandwich called the Marcus, proceeds going to veteran support organizations. The grocery store where cashiers had once eyed him with suspicion now had a photograph of him on the wall of local heroes. And the Treehouse, once mocked as worthless, became a historical landmark, preserved by the county as a reminder of the price of secrets and the power of truth. Marcus kept $5 million for himself from the legal fees that came back, and the small percentage David had arranged as finder's compensation. It was more money than he'd ever dreamed of having. He used some of it to buy Dorothy's farmhouse when she passed peacefully in her sleep 6 months after the trial. He renovated it, turned it into a retreat center for veterans struggling with PTSD, a place where they could find peace and purpose the way he had. He used more of it to fund scholarships at the local high school, to support the hardware store when business got tough, to help families in Timber Ridge who were struggling, not because he wanted recognition, but because Margaret's words had stayed with him. The dead don't need money, the living do. And he kept the treehouse. He reinforced it properly, replaced the rotting boards with new timber, installed solar panels, and proper insulation. It wasn't a death trap anymore. It was a home. His home. The place where he'd stopped running and started building something that mattered. 1 year after the story broke, Sarah Chen came back to Timber Ridge to do a follow-up piece. She climbed up to the treehouse platform where Marcus was sitting, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Being famous?" Marcus smiled. "Strange. I spent 15 years trying to be invisible. Now everyone knows my face. Any regrets?" He thought about it. About the death threats that still came occasionally. About the conspiracy theorists who'd made him into a folk hero or a villain depending on their politics. About the quiet life he'd lost. "No," he said finally. Gregory spent 20 years trying to figure out how to do the right thing. I got to finish what he started. That's not something to regret. What's next for you? Marcus gestured to the valley below. This, the retreat center, helping veterans, living quietly. I spent years running from my past. Now I'm finally building a future. Sarah smiled. That's a good ending. It's not an ending, Marcus said. It's a beginning. 2 years after buying the treehouse for $850, Marcus stood on the platform at dawn, coffee in hand, watching the forest wake up. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and possibility. Below him, the retreat center was just opening its doors to its first group of residents, veterans who'd been broken by war and were looking for a place to heal. He thought about Gregory often, about a man who'd carried an impossible burden for 20 years, who'd tried to honor his wife's wishes, who'd died protecting a truth he couldn't bring himself to expose. Gregory had been waiting for someone to come along, someone brave enough or stupid enough to finish what he'd started. Marcus had been that someone, not because he was special or heroic, but because he'd been broken too, and broken people understood each other in ways the whole could never grasp. The town of Timber Ridge had learned something important. That judgment came easy, but understanding took work. That the person everyone wrote off might be carrying something valuable, even if it wasn't visible on the surface. That kindness mattered more than conformity, and courage sometimes looked like a crazy man moving into a rotting treehouse. Marcus had learned something too. That running from your past didn't heal it. That isolation wasn't the same as peace. And that, sometimes, the most broken places, the most forgotten structures, the most dismissed dreams, held treasures worth more than money. The treasure wasn't the $289 million. It was never about the money. The treasure was purpose, connection, the chance to turn blood money into healing, secrets into truth, silence into justice. The treasure was looking 14 families in the eye and saying, "Your loved ones mattered. Their deaths weren't forgotten. Here's proof." The treasure was Dorothy dying peacefully in her sleep, knowing that Gregory's story had finally been told. It was Tom and Eliza standing beside him when the whole world seemed to turn against him. It was Patricia Summers opening a library in her brother's name, giving him back the future that had been stolen 40 years ago. And maybe, just maybe, the treasure was Marcus himself, learning that he wasn't just a soldier without a war, a man without a mission, a ghost haunting the mountains. He was someone who could still make a difference, someone who could still build instead of just survive, someone who mattered. As the sun crested the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold, Marcus raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. To Gregory, who'd kept his promise. To Margaret, who'd known the right thing to do even when it seemed impossible. To Dorothy, who'd told the truth even when silence would have been safer. To the 14 victims whose names were finally known, whose deaths were finally acknowledged. And to himself, the mountain man everyone had laughed at. The hermit in the rotting treehouse. The man who'd taken $850 and a broken structure and turned them into 289 million reasons why truth always matters more than secrecy. Anyone can find treasure if they're willing to climb high enough and dig deep enough. But the real treasure isn't what you find in hidden safes or forgotten attics. It's what you do with it once you find it. It's the choice to honor promises made by strangers, to stand up when everyone says to sit down, to speak truth when silence would be easier. Because in the end, the most valuable things in this world aren't measured in dollars or bonds or bank accounts. They're measured in lives changed, in wrongs righted, in courage found in the most unlikely places by the most unlikely people. As Marcus turned and headed back inside his home, the rotting treehouse that everyone had written off, now, standing strong and purposeful against the morning sky, he understood something profound. He'd come here broken, looking for a place to hide from the world. Instead, he'd found a place that asked him to face it. And in facing it, he'd discovered the greatest treasure of all, a reason to keep fighting, to keep building, to keep believing that one person, no matter how dismissed or forgotten, can still change the world. The mountain man had found his purpose, and the treehouse everyone laughed at had become a monument to the truth that some secrets are too important to stay buried, and some promises are too sacred to be broken. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible true stories that prove ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Click to continue this journey with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe truth, courage, and second chances still matter in this world.